It's picturesque, really. Well-groomed, obedient children walking into the doors of a small church. Walking with them, slightly behind, is a woman in a long dress, and possibly on her hip is the youngest of the group, head nuzzled to her bosom. Next to her is a man wearing long slacks, a dress shirt buttoned to the top, and a tie that's slightly too long or just a hair too short. And everything fits him a little bit big. They all share one thing, though, a smile. Everyone else looks like them, walks like them, dresses like them, and talks like them. It's almost robotic, mechanical, too symmetrical. But if you look a tad closer, those smiles aren't natural. They look forced. The husband's smile is instructive, almost like, wear a smile, or else. The wife has that smile of hesitation, wondering if anyone's buying it, if anyone can see behind it, hoping her husband doesn't look too closely and see how fake it really is, how forced it really is. The kids could be smiling out of pure ignorance. They don't know that everything's falling apart. Maybe one of the daughters is smiling because she gets to see her best friend. But the son is smiling because if he doesn't, he's got a date with his father in the room during service. They've all been trained. Going to church is an act in 4 parts: arrival, worship, after-service fellowship, and departure. Everyone else looks this way because it's an advertisement. Come here, and you too can enjoy an obedient family. Any slip up, and all eyes are on you. Any questions, and you might not fit the mold. Any deviation, and everything unravels. In a high-control patriarchal environment, life is a performance, and church is but a casting call. Heaven is for those who fit in, those who obey, those who follow the rules. Church gives you the instructions. Be this, don't be this. Wear this, definitely don't wear that. Hang out with these people, don't hang out with those people. Husbands, rule. Wives, obey. Children, if you don't make a sound, maybe we won't punish you. Maybe. The Lord's countenance falls upon those who earn it. Like the special episode we had for you with the BD Anubile on racism and Southern slavery after all things Christian nationalism, this episode is all about patriarchy in practice. Welcome to episode 16, Excursus, a conversation with Tia Levings on a well-trained wife. Trained wife, happy life. Tia Levings had a system. If only she followed it. She tried. She really did. But you're not graded on a curve. It's pass-fail. Join me in this conversation with Tia as we talk about marrying into the system, homeschooling, church, child-rearing, marriage, and worship, guided by the principles of patriarchy. I'll let Tia introduce herself.
My name is Tia Levings, and I wrote A Well-Trained Wife, My Escape from Christian Patriarchy. People might know me from my work online where I educate on the abuses in Christian fundamentalism. My handles are Tia Levings Writer. I do reels and lots of Substack content breaking down how fundamentalism and patriarchy is impacting our headlines, entertainment, family, deconstruction, the whole bit.
Awesome. All right. So how does Tia Levings find herself entrenched in these circles at the beginning?
Oh, yeah. So my book opens with my childhood, which is not someplace I wanted to start. I really wanted to focus on the scope of my first marriage, which really was bound in patriarchy from start to finish, and also bound in abuse from start to finish. Those were the years 1994 to 2007. I escaped at midnight with my children in a near murder suicide. So it is a very harrowing story. Viewers might be familiar with it, listeners rather. On Shiny Happy People, I appeared in that documentary because I was also part of the IBLP, Institute of Basic Life Principles, with Bill Gothard, which turned out to be my gateway drug. I grew up in a Southern Baptist church. And so after I escaped, I had to figure out why did I marry him? I had to go back to the roots of my childhood in fundamentalism that was rising in Southern Baptist mainstream. My pastor was the president of the Southern Baptist Convention, and it was a mega church. So it was a very normal mainstream evangelical experience. And I really want to emphasize that because there's so much that goes into the subtle grooming that leads one into fundamentalism and patriarchy. So while a lot of survivors were born into it and they have their own exit stories of what it was like to leave when that's all you know, I chose, we'll use with brackets, I chose to follow the mentorship of Christian fundamentalists as an adult, and then had to get myself and my children out of the abusive environment. So my story spans a lot of touch points that listeners from a lot of traditions will relate to.
Yeah. So were you born into this, or was it more after you got married? Was it more entrenched? How did that work from your childhood up into your first marriage?
I grew up, the first 10 years of my life, my parents just were like casual Christians, Christmas and Easter, and a few,
Okay.
it was a part of our life, but it wasn't dominant. I grew up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and to Midwestern, hardworking parents that were just as likely to get work done on Sundays as we were to go to church. When the economy tanked, we moved to Florida when I was 10, and we joined this big church downtown because that's what everyone in Jacksonville who wants to do anything that's where you went to church. And so that was in 1984. And what's really important about that date is that this is the beginning of the evangelical movement, where it's through the span of my growing up years, the next 10 years of my life, the movement itself was becoming more political, more national, more fundamentalist. And it was really becoming an America within America. So by then, I'm going to church 6 and 7 days a week. It's everything to me. My entertainment, my life, my relationships, everything is isolated within this Christian worldview. And I don't step a foot outside of that, footprint.
Yeah. So you were part of was it IBLP, the Gothard movement? We have quite a few stories on this series who came from Gothard or Gothard influence. What is that? If people have never heard of Gothard, maybe people have heard of the umbrella of authority, but what are some of the Gothard core teachings?
The overlap is really important because I think it's one of the ways that patriarchy spread its reach. So Gothard was this guy in Chicago who started this institute, and his method of evangelism was to have people come to these biblical conferences, these giant stadium events. And they would come to study the Bible, and so they would come from all different denominations because it wasn't limited to one specific denomination. And then they would go back into their churches and they would recruit more IBLP membership within the church. And so in our big church, we had like another little parachurch growing, this movement of homeschoolers who are very traditional, who dressed very strict gender roles, back to the land. We knew them because they had 8 and 9 children. Quiverful was not the norm in our Southern Baptist megachurch. We all had like the 2.5 kids, but we revered these big devout families. We knew they were living like a more holy kind of Christianity than we were willing to live, and maybe they were a little weird, but we didn't really, think that much about them. So meanwhile, in that 10 years, it's really spreading throughout America. And one of the ways that we have a lot of overlap, and this is why there's so many survivors with a little bit of each in their story, is because we went to homeschool conventions. And that's where people got Wilson's books and Sproul's books. And that's where, like, when the Reformed movement starts moving through evangelicism, that's how it came in, was through the homeschooling conventions. And I got involved as a young bride. I quickly had a new baby and I needed some mentorship. So I asked one of these older, wiser, quiverful moms to please help me get my baby to sleep at night, which brings in another big dominant influence with John MacArthur's church, because he was the parent pastor for Growing Kids God's Way in preparation for parenting.
Yeah.
And so again, that's another resource where all 3 houses were using this. And so the commonality of authors and books and materials provides this feeling of reassurance that you're in the right department, you're safe, you're listening to wise leadership, and it, becomes your own world and also leads you into an ever narrowing group.
Yeah. And we were even talking about before recording, you happened to be a young bride bearing kids right when all of these movements were intersecting with each other.
That's right.
The Gothard movement, the MacArthur movement, and the not quite the Wilson movement when his homeschooling curriculum started catching fire. So all these are. Had you gone to a Gothard conference?
That's the irony. I was never a paying member to the IBLP, but I was mentored in, and that's their model, is to go into these churches, find people to mentor and bring them into the lifestyle. So rising at the same time was the Duggar family on TV. Again, lifestyle evangelism, just learn to influence people, and they may not become actual members, which makes your deconstruction process a little tricky because you're like, wait a minute, I wasn't really part of that group, but you were completely under the influence of everything that they said and did. So yes, you are. I call it the cult without walls because it's mind control that's keeping you in. It's not membership to a specific body. The carryover was Sproul's ministry, Table Talk Magazine, and R.C. Sproul Jr. That kind of like was the gateway there that led to Wilson. So, we had the biggies at the time, obviously MacArthur, Piper, Wilson, Sproul Jr. Oh gosh, some of these names, like I just...
You probably got Piper in there, you got Grudem in there, you got MacArthur in there, you got a bunch of these people.
Yeah, you don't blink when you hear them because they're all saying similar things.
Yeah, which aids or fuels this intersection between all of the, they are saying all the same things. So when you go to one, they're not contradicting the other ones. You're like, oh, this is another person who's talking about the same stuff.
Yes.
And I can trust their resources, but all they do is just get you closer and closer and closer and closer confined in this system.
Two things completely went offline. One was any kind of examination of the fruit. We weren't really thinking about evidence-based ideology. We weren't listening to survivors or asking anybody, well, how did that work out for you? That was completely shut down. Also, ironically, critical thought was shut down because there was so much of a focus on apologetics.
Yep.
And we were arguing all the time about splitting hairs and theology that we thought we were thinking critically. We weren't actually taking a hard look at how we were living.
You were thinking within a system.
Right, exactly. But if you'd asked us at the time, we would have swore we were critical thinkers because we were apologetics.
You were critical in their understanding of critical thinking against other critical ideologies versus thinking like, wait a second, what am I saying and why am I saying it against these people or these thoughts or these ideas? So from the 80s, tangentially in the Gothard movement and the homeschooling movement, so where do you move from young bride, popping out kids? Where do you go from there?
In 1999, my third baby in 3 years, which was actually my fourth pregnancy, died of a heart defect. And it was a very significant dividing line in my story, in my life. I talk about her all the time. So it's kind of a book spoiler, but it's not really. The way that our traditions were handling grief wasn't something that I could do. I hadn't ever lost anybody before, but I couldn't go back and be who I had been, which was this very submissive, depressed, honestly, quiet, meek person. I couldn't just pretend my baby hadn't lived. And the pressure on me was to quickly get pregnant again, have the next baby, move on, give God all the glory. We were getting into, my husband was a theological geek. He just loved studying theology, which plays very well into this environment, and was doing a lot of reading about tulip and predestination and all of this. And so we make a move at the point of my daughter's life and death to an independent Baptist church, which was also involved in the family integrated church movement and was also very into Reformed theology. So while we weren't quite Presbyterian yet, we were definitely making a move, as was the movement. The movement was becoming more Reformed in its conversation.
Yeah. Can you talk a little more too? Because I think this plays a big role. And this is a less discussed aspect of this, that like the suppressing of the emotions, the suppressing of these depressive feelings, the suppressing of fear or angst or anxiety. And you just talked about it with losing one of your kids, where like, you can't really feel this.
Right. I wasn't supposed to show any visible signs that would make other people uncomfortable. There was like this general understanding that there's an okay time to grieve. And then when it's over, it's time to pack that up and move on. Yeah. I did have some friends who really tried to stand by me, but they also had to fit within the greater context. And our motherhood friendships and things like that were also beginning to be very restricted. So we just there was no access to grief or to any other feelings. And a lot came out because of this grief. I was already, hiding so much abuse. And I had just spent 2 months in Ronald McDonald House in a cardiac intensive care unit with my daughter, where I'd seen all kinds of different ways of being human. And frankly, being in an environment where it didn't seem God existed. A children's hospital is a very unique environment where it will challenge literally every single thing that you believe or you think that you believe. And I just couldn't ever go back to being who I was. I could pretend that she didn't exist. I'd also made her a promise that I would allow her life and death to change me. And I couldn't dishonor her memory that way. So the suppression, I still had to learn how to navigate it because it was still an expectation on me. And a big influence at this point was The Excellent Wife by Martha Peace, which really teaches a lot of behavior modification in your voice, your face, your smile. You practice and smile. You practice going dead in your eyes. And so I talk about Martha Peace's book a lot, in both in my book and in my work, because it's very pervasive church to church to church.
And you see some of the modern manifestations in Doug Wilson's daughters, Rebecca Merkel and Rachel Jankovic, who will talk about the same exact stuff, and more directed towards women, the emotional regulation, the obedience, the submission, that you can't feel things, that especially women's feelings are disruptive and they are sinful and there's nothing good in it, and you have to follow the guy because the guy is linear, he has no emotions. That is where truth comes from.
That's where my heart breaks, because I don't think anybody benefits from this model. I think the men suffer. I think the women suffer. I think they suffer with each other. They suffer on each other. They're hurting one another, but they're also, neither one of them is allowed to be human. Like, my husband should have had mental health care and taught to feel and express his emotions in healthy ways. And that wasn't available to us at all. The Wilson daughters, sorry, they hurt. I watched them and I hurt. I relate to how that could have been me if I'd stayed somehow alive in it. I would have died. But if things hadn't become so violent, I was trying to be a card-carrying influencer within that realm, and I was trying to be the best patriarchal wife and mother I could be in order to stay safe and give my children a happy childhood. And that idea, Rachel talks about it a lot, is that it can't be trusted. You can't be trusted. You can't trust yourself. And it's so anti-motherhood, because motherhood is at its heart an instinctive, nurturing response. And I couldn't be both. It was constantly tug of war within me as my instincts were screaming. And then I was trying to put this external control on them, all the while living with someone who didn't have a good grip on his emotions. They kept telling me that he was linear and in control, but he wasn't. He was erratic and violent, which I think is part for course in this environment.
Yeah. When it's so constrictive and silencing and everything else, there is both in a man and a woman's body, regardless of our kind of biological instincts, there is something that just bubbles up in you and is ready to burst at any moment, because you're not like that. That is explicitly spoken against. Any emotions that are unbefitting of the patriarchal mold are told are wrong, are sinful, can't let it out. You've got to present yourself as a certain kind of person so that other people can be influenced to join this movement as well. Yeah. So continue. So you, with the 90s, you had your third kid, and I know there's a kind of denominational development from independent fundamentalist Baptist into Southern Baptist churches into more Presbyterian Reform into the CREC. So we're somewhere in the 90s. Can you move further along this narrative? Because that's where some of these teachings get even more explicit, less environmentally charged and much more part of the doctrine of the church that is explicitly taught.
Yeah. So we'll go to 2003. Just to sum up my children, I had 9 pregnancies in 10 years, 5 live births, and 4 surviving children. So I was quiverful. And so in 2003...
was that intentional too? Was like the 9...
It's a consequence of not having birth control. And, I didn't have a lot of sex because my husband didn't like intimacy, but I somehow got pregnant every time. So
interesting. That's so against the message too, because like you're told in these circles that men just want sex all the stinking time, and the woman just like give it up because that's what the man wants. Yeah, no, I had very impersonal 5-minute encounters when he couldn't handle the stress of it anymore. And somehow I always got pregnant. Like I tell all about the sexual abuse in the book, because I think that
that is exactly why. It's underrepresented, that there's other forms. It's just a binary to say that all men are horny all the time and all women are not, and that it's always one way. It's just not. So in 2003, I was starting to break free mentally. I was reading and I was discovering women online, and I was having these humanities discussions through a website called the Trapdoor Society. And I was kind of learning how to keep my creative self separate from my church self, and like have little corners of myself. And
you cannot be creative in these circles. Yeah.
Right. No, and I could not be human, and I wanted my children to be happy. And so I was finding ways to have agency in different categories where I could. So I was very busy and distracted doing that. And while I was busy and distracted doing that, my husband was in a lot of theology forums, and like women swap recipes, men swap ideas, and
books.
They had, yeah, exactly. And books and basement tapes and how do you get your wife to obey? And so they had latched onto Wilson's books with federal marriage and the feudal system, and the idea that the husband was accountable for everything that his wife thought and did. Anyone in his household, he would stand before God and answer for this. And so the answer to the question, how do you get your wife to obey, had circulated on some forum. And the answer was discipline, spank her. Yep. So that becomes into my story in about 2004, 4, graphically. It was another instance of where it kind of broke my brain that this existed. And
had you been spanking your kids up to this point?
I had been pulling back from that. We spanked a little bit around 2001 and 2. And then as I left the Pearls and as I left the IBLP and as I started having like autonomy over our days at home, I wasn't spanking as much. And so I was making a move away from corporal punishment. But I never thought that older daughters, it would have shocked me then to know even that 17 and 18-year-old daughters were still spanked by their fathers. Yeah. And that is absolutely true in this world. There's no age limit on the corporal punishment in these books. It just is obviously carried. And when you listen to survivors, there's lots of girls that are spanked into adulthood until they pass into their husband's authority. And then
not
no
even
one
by
talks
their husbands or fathers, but by male school teachers in some of their schools.
It's like, it's a thing. And it's a thing no one wants to talk about. And so the idea of wife spanking was boggling to me. And I only complied with it because I was pregnant again and was very afraid of having another baby with a heart defect or any kind of defect. And I needed to stay safe. And the way that it was sold to me was that acts of controlled violence would be safer for everyone involved than acts of erratic violence. He would lose his temper with me less if he had a way to modify my behavior, which when you're in that world, that can sort of make sense. It's sort of
at least you're not going to hit me later. You're just going to slap me down.
At least you're not going to drag me across the floor. You're not going to sit on me. If I sit here and take this, then me and the baby will be safer. Yeah, was the rationale. And so that began. And while Wilson he's never going to say, I teach men should spank their wives. He's very skilled at that. All of the atmosphere is there. All the vitriol, the misogyny, all of it is there. And it's there in submission. Stories.
The wife, it's not just because he'll say this, a wife cannot just verbally submit or just say, I'm a submissive wife. She must show her submissiveness to her husband. It is the logical implication of what he says.
Right. When he says that wives should be handled with a firm hand. That's the same language we used when we were talking about spanking children. So it's the same. And he just doesn't get off the hook with that. Like there's survivor stories abundant. Rising, it's easier for when one survivor tells their story, others can say me too, and that's easier for them than all of us going first. So I think the more we talk about it, the more we'll talk about it.
Yeah. So when your husband was administering corporal punishment on you, and that's just we'll just call it spanking. Yeah. That seems a little tame, but corporal punishment on you. Where were you at in your church journey at this point? Had you landed at a Presbyterian Reformed church at this point?
We were at a PCA church, and he was not getting along with the elders because he was an obviously strident congregant, and the elders were more moderate, and they were trying to kind of pull him back a little bit. And the more that they tried to teach him some temperance, the more he leaned into his extreme views that he was studying at home.
They noticed his behavior.
Yeah. nobody knew what we were living under, but they could see the cracks. They could see not so happy. We had a sick baby when my son was very sick. So like we had some things happening that your church family is going to worry for you. They're going to know something's not quite right.
Or they should worry for you. Yeah.
Right. And we did. That church was very loving. And what it was a moderate PCA Pres congregation that had been taken over and cannibalized by extreme Presbyterians, which happened in the Baptist church too. It was this model where we'll just leave. We'll go over in here into this other church. They've got a small membership. We'll take over their buildings. And then there's this tension and split that happens. So that model was happening over and over again, and it happened there. So then he really wanted to get involved with the CREC, and there's only a few of them in the country. So
at this point,
through a series of self-sabotage, there's some plot points here that I won't go into, but we end up in Tennessee specifically to join the CREC, the sister church to St. Peter's.
And is this because your husband had been reading and following Wilson as he's like, we got to go to a Wilson church?
Yes.
Okay. So what?
Yes.
Because this is where I think the teachings, it's less under the hood and implicit, where it's patriarchal, it's submission, authority, and now it becomes far more explicit. What was the culture? Because I imagine it was there in seedling form and in some teachings and in some environmental, cultural stuff within the families of churches previous and platforms previous. What was the culture like coming into the CREC and now seeing you're not the only one who's being controlled? You're probably one of many women who are being controlled at this church.
It was terrifying. The whole concept of the move, everything was sold to me as a softer sell. I've always wanted to go back to the mountains. If you remember from the beginning of the conversation, I grew up in Michigan, so I don't like the Florida climate. And so I wanted to move away. And so this was sold to me as a way to be involved with a more agrarian church because it was modeled after St. Peter's. So St. Peter's is very agrarian. And there's lots of talk of that in the basement tapes and in the Reformation Day picnics and all the stuff that they do. Mm-hmm. And this was a congregation of like minds. And we were going to be there, like in Knoxville, there was a few resources with really great homeschooling community that was not necessarily Presbyterian. It was Christian, but it wasn't, It was everybody. So we had an opportunity to be really involved with this homeschooling community. We were going to get to live in the mountains. And I didn't really realize what we were getting into until we're there for the first Sunday. My husband had gone up first and he had talked to the pastor and the elders and had kind of prepared the way for us to come. So I come up to church and I'm going to, be there to meet all these like minds. And it was about, maybe 150 people, most of which were children. So it's like 10 families and,
10 kids per. Yeah.
Yes. And I should describe it for you, but it's like the quintessential CREC church. Like the heads of household, the male heads of household are at the end of each pew. Their families are down the pews next to them. They sit as families. They take communion as families. And
the husband first, who then gives it to the family, right? I think.
Yeah, exactly. So we're in the patriarchy, and we didn't call it that. We just called it like minds. We just called it Christian, the fellowship of believers, our family.
Like male-led, less explicit than patriarchal.
Right. And then we get in the parking lot, and they're openly talking, they openly talked about spanking. They openly talked about corporal punishment. And it's just nice. Like, mom's getting a spanking today. We got to go home because mom's getting a spanking today. And I almost dropped my child. I was like, I could not believe that we were in this world where everything that had been hidden in secret was now just out, like a potluck, and we had really good potlucks on Sundays. So we had these the Lord's Day fellowships, tables full of food, and we spent all day together. And it was the only day of the week the women were allowed to talk to each other, and the kids got to play, but there was a lot of bullying and weird dynamics happening with all the kids as they were acting out the stress of their homes. All this wholesome gender role stuff really was a factor in that congregation, because the boys had to be boys and the girls had to be girls, and it was tense. It was like walking into a surreal, what do I do now? I don't know what to do moment.
Yeah. And this sounds, I wouldn't say unique, but the stories people will hear on this series, especially so within the CREC or CREC influence or adjacent churches, was it tended to be whether the wife was real with herself or not, that both the man and the woman, or the husband and the wife, were both interested in the community, that they both wanted to go. And it sounds like from yours, you came into this skeptical, which I can't imagine went well with your husband.
It didn't. I got in trouble right away because I wanted to take my baby out of the service to go nurse him. And then I would wear him in a sling and I would stand at the back of the church and pat him. And that, like, the elders could tell that I wasn't like completely submissive spirit. I approached this like deal. My church is something, my spiritual church, my life, that is a big part of my life, but it's not my whole life. And I can come and go from my day-to-day, Monday through Friday, and then I can be somewhere else on Sunday. That it wasn't the case. They had one life. Like I was disobeying by being involved in the homeschool group. The Christian homeschool group. I was disobeying by taking my kids to the library and going on field trips and doing things that I thought were part of being a good educator. Were now, you need to really get your wife under control. Like the elders saw problems with me right away. The pastor loathed me. And this condescension of I just constantly needed correction began. And so I was trying to be a good church wife, make the good food for the potluck and raise my babies the way that we're supposed to. And we were doing, of course, catechisms and singing little songs and doing all the things. But I wanted more than the isolated life that was there, especially since we weren't allowed to be friends. The wives weren't allowed to be friends. Really? Yeah, no, we were only allowed to talk at psalm sings. Oh, I haven't even said that word in so long.
I know. No, we will hear about you. People hear about psalm sings and people loathing psalm sings after a while. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, singing is a huge deal in these groups, but also like I'm not opposed to singing, but a lot of the times it's kind of a way to glue the community together sociologically in a sense.
Yes. And you also are so exhausted after a Sunday that you're not ready for another one until the end of the week again, because you spend your whole day there and it's just, the repetitious of message and the control. Oh my word. I'm having little flashbacks just talking about it. Yeah. I don't usually speak to an audience that knows the inside lingo to that level, So I never say psalm sings in interviews, and I never talk about how our Lord's days were so comprehensive.
Yeah, no, I'm curious too, coming into this, what was your relationship like with Christianity coming into the CREC?
That's a great question. Privately, I was struggling because I was feeling less and less visible as a human. And I was feeling more interchangeable as you could just swap me out with another model. There's nothing about Tia that you need. Yeah, exactly. There's nothing about Tia that you need. And I was always getting in trouble just for being Tia. I was not a bad person. I was trying to obey and toe the line, but they hated me and saw me as a threat. And so that kind of narrative in my head was making me question my faith in ways I wasn't able to articulate for a couple years yet, because I wanted, if God was real and if faith was real, I wanted a God that valued my individuality. Who am I? And if he doesn't value Tia, if I'm just a cog in a wheel, if I'm just a baby maker, then I don't need that. I was starting to say I don't need that.
Yep.
In my head, not out loud.
I imagine that feeling was increased coming into a church and society that no longer, like you said, this wasn't under the water. This was the doctrine of this church, where you better fit in the mold, because if you don't, watch out.
Right. And the pain, the fruit of everything that we were doing was painful. My children weren't thriving. My marriage wasn't thriving. We were poor. We were isolated in this mountain town. Physically, our church decided that my husband needed to be home more, so they moved us to a town where we would be more isolated. So I was dealing with the fruit of it every day, and the fruit was nothing but pain. And so I couldn't separate that out from my faith and say, if this is God's will for me, then I would like to go be disobedient and a sinner, please, because I can't breathe. Whatever it takes. I stopped caring so much about towing the line, And my husband was initially compassionate to that. It's a rare window of compassion that he felt. And he stepped into his role to be the spiritual teacher anyway. He was like, well, you're not equipped for this anyway, so I'll do it. So he was doing all of the catechism and logos teaching and Latin and McGuffey readers and everything that we had to do as a result of being part of this society.
You said you were aware of Doug Wilson and more patriarchal or submission authority. You were aware of those teachings before coming into the CREC, right?
Yeah, he had was it blog and Mayblog?
Yeah, Credit Agenda, blog and Mayblog, all this fun stuff.
I was a blogger. He was a blogger. I made the critical error of thinking Doug Wilson was just another theological pastor putting out books. Whoa, that is not true.
No,
but I did think that
That's
at
what you got to get right.
Yeah, exactly. I would have been more aggressive in getting his materials out of my home the ways that I could in the beginning, if I had any idea what it was leading to. But yeah, I was aware of it because I was online and I was talking to other women, and we were getting into our own theological arguments, and Doug Wilson's materials and Nancy's too were the fruit of her hands were being passed around.
So was the CREC, was that your last church stop in this journey?
It's not. Everything in our lives came to a pretty big head when they moved us out to this mountain town. My husband no longer wanted to make the long drive into town, and I no longer wanted to really put any energy towards a faith that was keeping me so suppressed.
Yeah.
And I was suicidally depressed at that point. So I had this crisis of faith, and I went to the library and I said, God, if you're real, I need you to show me a different way to be a Christian. And I checked out a book in every single denomination. Oak Ridge, Tennessee has an incredible library system because it was part where the lab was. And so there's a lot of smart people that all donated their collections to the library system when they died in their estates. And so the library is this gem. And so they had a huge religion section. And I checked out all of these books on the world's religions. And at the very top was At the Corner of East and Now by Frederica Matthews Green. And she introduced me to Eastern Orthodoxy, which I had some common ties because Frank Schaeffer had been involved in, and the Schaeffer, Edith and Frank Schaeffer had been, Francis rather, had been part of our background. So these were familiar names. Frederica also did movie reviews for NPR. And so I was familiar with her name. I read it, and my husband got very excited about it. And this ultimately led to my excommunication, because then I wrote about the discovery of Eastern Orthodoxy, and specifically that they venerated the Mother of God, Mary, and that men who venerated women were different kinds of men. Like, it just seemed like men did better when they allowed for some sort of intelligence and giftedness from female society. And so that did not go over well with the elders who closely monitored my blog. They were already mad that I was writing this little homeschool blog. It wasn't little, actually. It was called Living Deliberately, and it was getting 80,000 hits a day. And it was a very big lifestyle blog in the beginning of blogging. And they didn't like that I was writing in my own name, not my husband's name. So I was already kind of on their
naughty list.
She's naughty list. And I was on the naughty list anyway.
Yeah.
So when I wrote that, it led to a series of discipline meetings and ultimately an excommunication.
What's so interesting is the mommy bloggers and influencer bloggers in the series now are lauded. They're venerated.
Yeah. They had to come around.
The bigger your footprint is, the more that they're going to push you out, which is so interesting that when you were there, that they're like, no, we can't have you have a voice. But now it's like, well, if you have a voice and you're CRC adjacent or in the church, like, please get your blog out there.
Yeah, I would have been, again, I was a trad wife, essentially. And if I'd had Instagram and all of that, I would have been doing that. And that was my defense of it in the beginning, of like, I'm promoting family values. I'm blogging about homeschooling. Your
church is going to grow huge because of my blog.
You should be happy about this. And I blogged about our services and romanticized them all the time. And he could not handle that it was in my own name. He could not stand it.
Gotcha. And what another interesting thread is, I don't think it's all of Eastern Orthodoxy, but there are pockets of Eastern Orthodoxy that practice paedo communion, which is a shared distinctive with the CREC, which you would think if you're talking about this, I know now they speak more positively about Eastern Orthodoxy. It's just, it's such an interesting, they will describe themselves as so monolithic through time that they've always thought this stuff and said this stuff or upheld these bloggers or these influencers, but that's not the case in these circles.
Oh, it's a big part of my excommunication. I think you're going to like that section of the book. Paedo communion was extremely important to my husband because of our daughter. And the whole idea, so they told us, we'll release your membership if you can find a like-minded congregation of believers. And it was actually the thing that broke my brain. I was like, if the CREC is so right, why isn't there one on every corner? I need to go all the way back before the schisms. Like, I went back to Eastern Orthodoxy because it was before the split with Catholicism even. I wanted to know how Jesus went to church. What's the closest thing to that? It's not CREC.
No, it's not.
Shocker.
Yep. So yeah, what happened after the CREC? Because I'm assuming this gets closer and closer to your break from
it does. This. When we left all of that external patriarchal control, my ex-husband, who was still my husband at the time, couldn't cope. He needed that external boundary. And so what I've learned now is that people crave fundamentalism when they're in chaos, because fundamentalism always gives you a clear formula,
rigidity,
good promise,
solidness. It gives you something to there's like a ballast in the storm.
Exactly. And so the organic calm of orthodoxy took away the walls, and he didn't have anything holding him up. And so what began for him, then my story shifts into his descent into full mental illness and to a psychotic break that led to the kind of violence that made us have to escape.
Yeah. So, I mean, we don't have to get into everything in your book, but so what did your escape look like? How did you get out? Because it's not normal for people to get out of these situations unscathed.
It's not. And I waited too long. One of my messages is that I stayed in the toxic situation way too long because I kept thinking I could fix it. I could improve it.
I think everyone thinks that.
Safe. Yeah. And then it's a habit of mine that I Pollyanna it, or I put optimism on it. And I think that I can do it. So what happened is that there's a series of events where it was just escalating. And they're classic signs. There's some animal violence and reporting me missing, and there's some different things that led up to this. But the nuts and bolts of it is that it was Halloween of 2007, and I knew I was going to leave in the next few days because of what had been going on. I had a priest who was going to help me escape during the day, but we didn't get that far. My husband snapped after our first Halloween. It was the first year my kids were going to trick or treat. After they went to bed, he held me hostage for 4 hours, threatening to kill me with a length of firewood. And then after those 4 hours, he did something he'd never done before. He said, I'm out of here. And he had never left in what I would have called a fight at the time. I wasn't speaking or doing anything because I was, avoiding being beaten. And he left, and it was to go get his gun from his office. And I heard a voice in my head say, run. And so I grabbed my kids and I left, and we passed him on the way through town. And if I'd stayed at home, we'd be dead.
So you got out. And I think maybe if you can summarize how did you get to the point you're at now where you can talk about this freely? Because this is something survivors are tremendously scared about. They're both scared for obviously what happens to them in the marriage or in the church, but I think they're either equally or maybe more frightened about what happens after I'm gone.
Right. It's the second half of the story, and it really is its own story. My second book is A Soul of Healing. It's coming out in 2025, which is my healing journey. And I deal with it some at the end of A Well-Trained Wife, just not in the kind of depth that it deserves. So I was in shock for a long time. We had to have a very extensive divorce process. There was 2 forensic investigations into custody. There was mental hospital breaks that my ex-husband went through. Lots of things. I went through 10 years of trauma therapy, and I started writing my story as a therapeutic exercise in 2011. It didn't sell. I mean, I sold it until on the 13th draft when I tried to, basically, based on the idea that I felt like this is coming for our country. I knew I had a story. And so I had started was a journal, and then it was a novel, and then it was an autobiographical memoir with a pseudonym. And then when I was ready to step in my own power and use my voice and say, this is who I am and this is what happened to me, that's also the reflection of all that trauma work that I had to do for all of those years, putting myself back together, approaching it with a spirit of wholeness and a desire to take my life back and not give any more of my life to this high control and abuse. I always say it took my past, it doesn't get my present and future too. And I feel that because it's been so politicized and it's interwoven into our laws and headlines now, that the world that I escaped, that I actually drove away from and risked everything to escape, is coming for our country. And the only way people are going to know what it's like to live that is if survivors tell, here's what it's like behind closed doors when somebody like that is in control of you. And there's just not that many people who can do it without re-traumatizing themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. And welcome to the series, what we're doing and trying to get this.
Thank you.
Yeah. This word out for what's happening. This is a fun little snippet. And I think this is going to lead into two of my concluding questions, which are related to each other. And the first one is for somebody maybe like yourself early on, or maybe a little bit more ignorant of the situation, not as astute to like, oh, there's some bad stuff going on in here. But somebody who's, like you said, who's seeing or who's perceiving societal breakdown, who's perceiving that things are crumbling around them, as they want solidity, they want rigidity, they want a solid system that tells them what to do and what to be and how to act, who are looking at Christian patriarchy and like, well, maybe it's not the best option, but it's better than what I see outside in society. If you can talk to that woman who's considering this movement because everything she sees around her.
Yeah, I urge her to listen to people who've actually been through it. We have something now that we didn't have back when I was young, and that's survivor stories and evidence. We have something to counter the promise. So I spend a lot of time talking about how fundamentalism is attractive. The trad lifestyle has a pretty aesthetic to it. They're selling you this ideal without telling you what it's really like. And if you're going to choose this for your family, you are entitled to know, what is it really like? How does that work? Before you use your own family as its test case and repeat the same mistakes other people have experienced, find out from first accounts what it's like to actually be there and look at the outcomes, because that's the antidote to idealism is well, what is the outcome? What's the evidence say?
Yeah. And then for another group, we'll call them those who are stuck, women who are stuck in the system, because it's generally not the woman who can get out. It's the man who runs the show, or the husband who runs the show, or the father who runs the show, or elder, or whoever it may be. For those who are listening to this series and are starting to clue in, like, this sounds a lot like my story, and this has been rumbling around. I'm thinking about this now. This is the prick in my brain and my heart, and I can't get rid of it. But like, what do I do? How do I get out of this? And I know we can't give them exhaustive instruction, of course, but like any advice or just wise counsel that you would give from somebody who's done this herself?
I always give compassion to where you are and understand that you're using the resources that you have. If you're feeling those thoughts, you're hearing those thoughts, that is your instinct. You can also call it the Holy Spirit or the still small voice or whatever helps you. But if you are feeling that resistance inside that deserves to be honored, if you're in a situation where it's not safe to speak that, then that's information for you. You should be able to speak that. And if you're not, then you need secular resources. I would be very careful going to any religious ideology for support, because I've been there, done that, and they were not helpful. Their loyalty was to the system before it was to humanity. And I always say anti-fundamentalism is to value people over ideas. So if your humanity is struggling within a system, you are more important than that system, period. We want your survival. We want your health and thriving. If you are the parent in that situation and you're the only other responsible adult in the room and someone else is oppressing you, you owe it to those children to be the adult in the room. And that's hard to accept, and it's very challenging. It might mean you have to get really creative in how you seek for your resources, but I would go with your area shelters, your area police, your area domestic violence advocates. Be just very careful who you reach out to in a religious standpoint, but don't act like you're too weak or submissive and your husband has to lead the way. Like if you see the need and you're someone's mother, you have a responsibility to show up for those kids.
Awesome. Now, any final thoughts? Anything that you want to more particularly impress on those who are listening, especially within patriarchy? Anything we've talked about that you want to leave listeners with?
Yeah, I always say center survivors, listen to their stories. You may not agree or relate to point for point, but take what you can and amplify their experiences.
Patriarchy promises, but it doesn't deliver. It's a system of do's and don'ts with scare tactics thrown in for good measure. It's a system that works for those inside of it, if you can call it that. Its promises are based on performance, an unquestioning allegiance to the infallibility of the teachings. It's us versus them, a well-ordered, well-trained people versus the disorder of the godless society. Patriarchy shouts works and whispers grace, requires strict adherence to the set of dogmas that are an odd blend of Christian doctrine through a particular cultural lens. It's father rule under elder rule under pastor rule. Men set the system and women do their best to keep up, stay quiet and out of the way. Children are given their marching orders with a clear, albeit narrow, pathway towards patriarchal success. Men are prized for their leadership, and women are needed to give birth to them. It's supposedly the way the world has always run, or rather, should always run. But we've lost our bearings and need to be redirected due north. It's a system that needs to be served to survive, which is funny when you think about it. A system that claims to follow Christ needs to be served. A system which expects sacrifice to keep it going claims to follow the one who was sacrificed. Patriarchs who expect perfection or kick you to the side of the road to fend for yourself claim to follow the patriarch who cast his son outside the city in order to gift you his perfection as your own. Jesus, the God-man, took in the women, the outcast, the foreigner, the widow, the adulteress. He did not train them. He gave himself up for them. We don't live a well-trained life. We live a well-graced life, and thank God for that. I'd like to thank Tia Levings for her time and vulnerability by sharing her story. Pick up her book if you haven't already. It's in the show notes. Next week is the end of Season 1 of Sons of Patriarchy, where I talk with Dr. Karen Rudkowski about her book, Understanding Spiritual Abuse. We'll see you then. Sons of Patriarchy is brought to you by the administrators of Examining Doug Wilson in Moscow in partnership with Peter Bell. It's written, produced, and edited by Peter Bell. Original music, sound design, and mixing by Aaron Feeney. This series wouldn't be possible without the dozens of abuse survivors whose bravery and vulnerability make it what it is. Every episode was sent to them before being published, and their feedback, edits, encouragement, and eventual approval make this what it is. May your voices be heard far and wide. Thank you.